Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Simone from our eighth grade social studies class at Sewanaka with Miss Pritchard. So we're here for a video on imperialism with an emphasis on the Spanish-American War as a turning point. But we're going to go way back. Let's start with this. What does it mean for a country to have a foreign policy? It's how a nation deals with other countries. And in the United States, the person who's responsible for that is the Secretary of State. The current Secretary of State is Antony Blinken. There's a picture of him right there. The first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Now, way back, this is seventh grade material for you. In 1823, um, under President James Monroe, the U.S. issued what was called the Monroe Doctrine. At that time, the United States said to European nations that you should stay out of the Western Hemisphere, stay out of North and South America. But at that time, the U.S. wasn't really strong enough to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It established it, but it really becomes like the foundation of America's foreign policy for over 100 years. But when we get to the Spanish American War in a few seconds, you're going to see how the US develops the strength to actually enforce this policy. Also, in seventh grade, you learned about manifest destiny. Please don't forget, this is the belief that the US should expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, why do I bring this up? It was a phrase that was coined by John L. O'Sullivan. I bring it up because by 1853, the US had acquired all of the land that you see here in the map. So it starts the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. We bought Florida from Spain in 1819, annexed Texas in 1845, around the same time. We figured out a way to acquire the Oregon country. And then after the Mexican American War, we acquired this whole area called the Mexican Cession. And then following the war, there was one last purchase made. It was called the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. So what you know of as the continental United States, these are 48 of our states, was finished by 1853. Then, after the Civil War, the US starts to think about becoming an imperialist nation. That's when a country takes over other land. It can be by force, it can be purchasing it. And these are the reasons why the US wanted to become an imperialist power. So, number one, if it's a place we could sell new goods. Remember, late 1800s is the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, you see the rise of big business, unlike any other time in American history. What do those businesses want? They want raw materials, they want natural resources, and they want places to sell their goods. Imperialism fulfilled all of those requests. That's a big reason why the US decided to embark on this policy. Another possible cause is that America wanted to spread its way of life to other people. Third cause would be competing with European powers. When you get to 10th grade, you're going to learn about something called the Berlin Conference. That's when the European countries all met in Germany and decided how they were going to cut up parts of Africa in an imperialist agenda. And that's a whole separate topic that you'll learn about in 10th grade. And then lastly, as we will see as one of the causes of the Spanish-American War, sometimes U.S. becomes imperialistic to help people overseas. Now, before we can get to that war, there are two places the U.S. acquired before the Spanish-American War. The first one is Alaska. That's way back in 1867, only 2 years after the Civil War ended. It was the Secretary of State, William Seward, who made the decision to give Russia $7.2 million for this land. Now, Alaska, this is probably not the best map, but it's way, way, way up in the northwest corner of Canada. It's very close to Russia. And people mocked Seward for it. They called it Seward's folly. Why would you want to buy this giant icebox? Turned out to be a great purchase because Alaska has gold and oil. So that was a straight purchase. But this one, the annexation of Hawaii, has a much more complicated history. Hawaii was this republic, a monarchy, King Kamehameha and Queen Liliuokalani ruling what was a very diverse group of settlers. But there were Americans who lived on the island as well. And they led a rebellion to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. So once that happened, there was a couple of years before the U.S. decided to add Hawaii on as a territory. It was under President McKinley. The president before him, Grover Cleveland, didn't want to do that. Please note that Alaska and Hawaii, while they were U.S. territories, did not become states until, I'm going to say, 1959. So they don't become the 49th and 50 states until then. Okay, so now what is this Spanish American War I keep referring to? It is primarily a war to defend Cuba from Spain. So the Cubans were a colony of the Spanish, and they were being mistreated by the Spanish military rulers. There was one guy, Valeriano Weyler, whose nickname was like the Butcher. So there is mistreatment, and it's probably extremely bad. But in addition to that, the U.S. had a lot of money invested in Cuba, about $50 million. So when the Cubans started to burn down their sugar fields, that got the Americans' attention. But the key cause historians always want you to know is that some of these stories may have been exaggerated. So the term yellow journalism came into play. That's when you take stories that are based on some sense of truth, but you exaggerate them. And they did that to sell newspapers. Some people even think that the newspaper editors wanted this war to happen. There's one quote from William Randolph Hearst, I believe. The two leading newspaper editors were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And I believe he said, you furnish the pictures and I'll get you the war. So there were even cartoons that were drawn to show the Spanish atrocities. Now, a fourth cause, the Delaunay letter. The Spanish sent a letter in which they mocked President McKinley, called him weak. Now, that wasn't an unheard of commentary on our president. Even our very own Theodore Roosevelt once said that McKinley had the backbone of a chocolate eclair, that he was not a very strong president. But here's your spark of the war. This is your immediate cause. The immediate cause is the sinking of the Maine. So we had a U.S. battleship. It's sailing off the coast of Cuba, and it blew up. 262 maybe sailors, everybody dead on board. We immediately blamed Spain. So the newspaper headlines were, "Remember the Maine." It became our battle cry. It's the spark of the war. McKinley has Congress declare war very immediately. Now, much, much later, 1971, we did a study of the ship, and the Navy concluded that it really wasn't the Spanish that blew it up, that it was actually just an accident that the engine blew up in the ship. But that, again, was not found out until much later. All right, so the war begins. You keep seeing me reference Secretary of State here. Our Secretary of State, John Hay, actually called it a splendid little war. Could you even imagine the Secretary of State getting away with that phrase today? But it's a very, very quick war. It took months to fight. More people actually died from disease than they did from the battle with the Spanish. And Theodore Roosevelt became more of a national figure. He led his troops, they're called the Rough Riders, in this war. So now, once the war is over, the U.S. wins. And why is it called a turning point? Well, it's because before the war, the U.S. was definitely growing in strength, but it wasn't until this war is over that the U.S. is really viewed as a dominant world power. So this is when the U.S. starts to exert its reach all over the globe. So everything I do following this slide is just one different place after another that the U.S. had some sense of influence in. So it starts with the treaty that ends the war. U.S. receives three places, Puerto Rico, Guam, and paid $20 million for the Philippines. Guam is way out in the Pacific Ocean. It was a good place for us to have our naval ships refuel. But we also got a military base on the island of Cuba. So we didn't actually get Cuba, but we had a military, we still have it, Guantanamo Bay, on the island of Cuba. And we kind of made Cuba follow our lead without just taking them over. We made them include provisions in their constitution that kind of, we used the phrase protectorate over Cuba. Now, in the Philippines, a lot of Americans don't realize this. They were part of the Spanish Empire as well. When the war was over, they expected to be free. And we didn't give them that independence. So they actually led a revolt against us. This is a very famous name in Filipino history, Emilio Aguinaldo. I got to change the spelling of that. Sorry. He led this insurrection against the United States. More people actually died, more soldiers, in the Filipino insurrection, 3 years, 1902 to 1905, than did in the Spanish American War. It's not even close, I think, the numbers. People are just not aware of this. But the U.S. was able to withstand the insurrection, but it was not until after World War II that the Philippines became an independent country. Now, Puerto Rico, we did a lot of this in class. You did a nice job during remote learning, brief remote learning. Puerto Rico, the status is a commonwealth. So, what that basically means, they are not allowed to vote for the president in the general election. They also don't pay federal income taxes. And Puerto Rico is not a state, but it is a U.S. territory. This debate is ongoing. Should Puerto Rico become free? Should it be independent? Should it become the 51st state? It's an ongoing debate and discussion that, I guess, like I said, you did a nice job with in class. But that's another result of the war. Now, this is higher level, but I know some of you are really interested in this. These are a series of Supreme Court cases, the insular cases. That's the Supreme Court at the time. And these cases question, when the U.S. takes over territory, should those people, there are people living there, should they get the same constitutional rights as Americans living in the continental U.S.? And the Supreme Court said no. Said I believe the phrase was, the Constitution does not follow the flag. That was a pretty controversial ruling at the time. And again, it's more than one case that dictated that. Now, in China, we issued what was called the open door policy. Um, we simply said that all countries should have equal access to trading in China. Prior to that, the European countries had drawn up certain areas, like this would be for France, and this would be for Spain, and this would be for Russia. And the US believed everybody should have access in China. Well, the problem with that is that China did not want anybody there, or at least some Chinese did. So there's a whole group, they were called the League of Harmonious Fists. And they basically staged a rebellion in which if they saw a foreigner, they tried to kill them. And that's called the Boxer Rebellion. All right. Now, the main result for the U.S. foreign policy after the Spanish-American War, after McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt became president. And he issued what's called the Big Stick Policy. His Big Stick Policy is that the U.S. is going to be the international police, and it's an extension of this Monroe Doctrine. So it's sometimes officially called the Roosevelt Corollary. The U.S. is going to become this international police force and believe that it can basically interfere or interject in affairs all over the world. But primarily, this was a Latin American issue because that's where the U.S. did not want European nations to intervene in. And that's just another political cartoon that illustrates the Big Stick Policy. And again, called the Big Stick Policy, European English police officers will carry like a nightstick. I guess most police officers do. Now, while that's all going on, we have plans to try to build a canal through Central America. And you can see on the map the reason why is because rather than having to take ships and go all the way around South America, it would be much easier if we could build a canal that would go right through. Problem is we had to find a location to do this. And they first thought about Nicaragua, but it was a little bit too wide. So then they thought Colombia would be a great place. Well, the Colombian government rejected our deal to allow us to build it. We offered the money. The Colombians said no. So I apologize. I got to backtrack. It was Panama that we wanted to build it in, but Colombia owned Panama. That was I forgot that important part. So we went to the Colombian government saying, can we build this in Panama? And the Colombian government rejected I think it was like a $25 million offer. So then what happened is the Panamanian people revolted against the Colombian government. And once they became independent, that's when we were able to build the Panama Canal. We no longer have, it took about 10 years. Economically, it helped us tremendously. But Jimmy Carter, who you'll learn about later in the year, he was a president who gave the canal back to the Panamanians. That transfer took place in 2000. Okay, there's also another war that's going on after the Spanish American War. It's not involving us, it's with Russia and Japan. But I bring it up here because when the war was over, it was Teddy Roosevelt that helped negotiate the peace treaty. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of it. So, again, just to illustrate how the US is really exerting its power, this couldn't have happened 100 years ago. And once that war was over, Teddy Roosevelt made a decision that he asked the Navy, paint our ships, all white, make them look brand new, sparking new, and just sail the ships all over the ocean so the world could see them. And he called it the Great White Fleet. So I know I went a little bit quick, but gives you a good overview of what led up to the Spanish American War and what happened as a result of the Spanish American War, and how this is such a significant turning point. And these political cartoons, again, just illustrate how the US is really becoming a world power at this time. So thank you for listening and keep up the great work, and I will see you all in class.